first time you feel Saint Cyprian isn't in a church. It's in a cramped Roman courtroom where the air smells like old sweat, wax, and fear. A clerk dips his pen, scratches a name into the record, and the ink blots. Thick, ugly, like a crushed insect. Someone nearby retches quietly, trying not to be noticed. Outside, in the sunlit street, a vendor sells warm bread and honey cakes like it's an ordinary day. Inside, a man is being asked a simple question that will decide whether he keeps his head on his shoulders. He is not a peasant, not a naive dreamer, not a man who didn't know what he was getting into. He is educated, wealthy, polished, the kind of person who can win arguments with a smile and ruin reputations with a sentence. And now the empire wants him to do something small, just a pinch of incense, a few grains, a polite gesture to the gods of Rome, and he refuses. That contrast is the point. That's the trapdoor under the story. Because the real question isn't how did he die? The real question is, how does a man built for comfort become a man built for fire? And why, centuries later, an ocean away, do Christians in Nigeria still call his name with reverence as if his courage has not expired? To answer that, we have to go back, not to the courtroom, but to the smells, sounds, and ambitions that made him. Carthage in the early 3rd century was a city with a double mouth. One mouth recited poetry and law, the other devoured people. It glittered with marble and commerce, and underneath it ran the nervous system of an empire. Taxes, bribes, patronage, favors owed, favors paid back with interest. You could rise here fast if you knew how to speak. And Cyprian, Thasius Caecilius Cyprianus, learned to speak like a weapon. Picture him as a young man moving through colonnades and crowded forums, where arguments were entertainment and reputations were currency. He would have been trained in rhetoric the way soldiers were trained in swordplay, not for beauty, but for domination. A good speaker could turn a mob, soften a judge, shame an opponent into silence. A great speaker could make truth feel optional. Cyprian grew up in a world where language wasn't just communication, it was control. He was born into privilege, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself loudly because it's already understood. He had access to education, and education meant power, the ability to interpret law, to navigate elites, to be invited into rooms where decisions were made. In Roman Africa, status could cling to you like perfume, invisible but undeniable. He drank that world in. And if you imagine young Cyprian as naturally kind, naturally humble, naturally gentle, erase that picture. This story doesn't start with a halo. It starts with polish, with ambition, with the quiet hunger to be taken seriously, to be respected, to be feared a little. He studied, taught, and moved among the upper layers of Carthaginian society, where people praised virtue while living off exploitation, where a man could argue for justice in the morning and profit from injustice by afternoon, without even feeling the contradiction. There's a reason the story later hits so hard. Cyprian knew exactly what comfort tasted like. Carthage was not just a city of speeches. It was a city of shrines and smoke. Religion was everywhere, public, political, social. The gods weren't simply believed in, they were managed. Offerings kept the universe predictable. Rituals kept society stable. Loyalty to the gods meant loyalty to Rome, and loyalty to Rome meant safety. Christians, in that environment, weren't just people with different ideas. They were suspicious. Their refusal to sacrifice looked like sabotage. Their secret meetings sounded like conspiracy. Rumors stuck to them like grime. That they were atheists, that they hated humanity, that they were unpatriotic, that they practiced dark rites. To be a respectable citizen was to look at Christians the way a well-fed household looks at a fire in the kitchen, not curious, but alarmed. Cyprian, in his youth, would have had every reason to despise them, if only because they refused the social game that made men like him successful. They didn't flatter the powerful gods. They didn't buy safety with incense. They said there was one God above the empire, above the Senate, above the old spiritual machines that kept everyone obedient. That kind of belief is not spiritual. It's explosive, and Cyprian's world was built to contain explosions. So he lived the normal life of a rising man: eloquence, networks, influence. He would have been praised for brilliance, invited to banquets where laughter was expensive and cruelty could be dressed as humor. He would have watched clients bow to patrons, watched the weak orbit the strong, watched the city's poor treated like background noise. In the empire's performance, there is a particular kind of disgust that comes from seeing how the system works from the inside and benefiting from it anyway. It's not the disgust of poverty. It's the disgust of complicity. Carthage could be beautiful in a way that made you forget it was dangerous. White stone, bright sun, sea wind. But it was also a place where bodies could be cheap, where punishments were public, where entertainment could include humiliation, where a person could be erased socially long before they were ever executed. And while Cyprian climbed, something else climbed too, quietly in the corners of the city: the Christian community. They weren't powerful in the Roman sense. They didn't have statues. They didn't have official robes. Many of them didn't have money. What they did have was a strange internal gravity, a discipline, a willingness to suffer that made them, uncomfortably, hard to control. That's the first twist the story quietly plants. Christianity did not spread in spite of pressure. It spread partly because pressure revealed who was real. When persecution flared, it wasn't just the poor who suffered. Sometimes the wealthy were targeted too, because their compliance mattered. Rome didn't only want to punish, it wanted to teach. It wanted to make an example. See, even your leaders bow. Cyprian would have noticed that. He was too sharp not to. And then, somewhere in his adult life, he encountered a man who would become the hinge of the whole story. A Christian priest named Caecilius. We don't have to romanticize this meeting as a lightning bolt. It may have been slow. It may have been uncomfortable. It may have started as a debate, because men like young Cyprian loved debate. Imagine Cyprian, confident in his education, meeting Caecilius and expecting an easy victory, expecting to dismantle a superstition with logic and wit, expecting applause. But instead he finds something irritatingly durable, a faith that doesn't bend under cleverness. Caecilius would not have matched Cyprian blow for blow as an orator. That's not the point. The point is that Caecilius likely carried a different kind of authority, an authority that comes from refusing to be bought, from having nothing to prove to the empire, from not needing the approval of men who think they own reality. That kind of person is hard to defeat in argument because they are not fighting the same game. It's like watching a man try to punch smoke. Cyprian could win debates, but could he win peace? Because here is what rhetoric often hides: the speaker's own emptiness. A skilled orator can make other people feel small. But when the crowd goes home and the lamps go out, the orator is left alone with himself. And Cyprian, for all his public success, seems to have started hearing a private question that wouldn't shut up. If my life is so successful, why does it feel like it's rotting from the inside? That's not a poetic exaggeration. People in Cyprian's world were surrounded by decay, literal and moral, disease, corruption, exploitation. The beautiful city had a shadow, and the shadow wasn't just outside. It got into the soul. This is where the second twist begins. The Christian message that hooks Cyprian isn't simply, "be nice," or "believe this." It's the claim that a person can be remade, washed, reset, reforged, not by self-improvement, but by a kind of death and rebirth of identity. For a man trained to build his identity on reputation, that's terrifying, because it means surrendering the one thing he's spent his whole life polishing: himself. And the competitor in his story, the enemy that will later become explicit, starts as something very close: pride, the Roman career ladder, the audience, the applause, the need to be right, to be admired, to be safe. But a human enemy is coming too. In Cyprian's world, the church wasn't a cozy club. It was a pressure cooker. Joining it didn't solve conflict. It invited conflict into your house. The Christians of Carthage were already under strain, some brave, some afraid, some bargaining with fear. Some wanted strictness, others wanted mercy. Some wanted unity, others wanted influence. And the empire itself, patient, massive, irritated, was always there, like a boot hovering above a glass. Cyprian, moving closer to this community, would have been like a man in clean clothes stepping into a room full of smoke and sweat, and whispered prayers, where people had seen friends dragged away, where betrayal was possible, where courage had a cost. He would have seen scars. He would have seen the tired eyes of people who had chosen a harder road. And maybe, this is the uncomfortable, almost grotesque part, he would have felt something like envy, not envy of their suffering, envy of their certainty. Because certainty is a luxury when you've built your life on performance. And the more he listened, the more something in him began to crack. Not in a dramatic movie conversion way, more like the slow fracture of a stone under constant pressure. A tiny line first, then a wider split. Then the realization that the whole structure might collapse. Here's a vivid image to hold on to. A man standing in front of a mirror after a banquet, smelling wine on his breath, hearing laughter, still echoing in his head, and suddenly feeling it all as thin, like shiny paint on damp wood, like a beautiful mask starting to stink. That's the kind of disgust that isn't directed at others. It's directed inward. Cyprian's education made him sensitive to beauty. His ambition made him sensitive to status. But the Christian community introduced him to a different kind of beauty. Integrity. A person whose yes meant yes, whose no meant no, even if it cost them everything. And for someone who has spent years learning how to bend words, integrity is not comforting. It's an accusation. So the early story of Cyprian is not nice man becomes holy man. It's successful man discovers he's living inside a lie, and once that realization takes hold, comfort becomes suspicious. Pleasure becomes compromised. Praise becomes a trap. The old life doesn't just feel empty, it starts to feel contaminated, like you can't wash it off your hands. This is Act 1 tightening its grip. Because when a man like Cyprian changes, he doesn't change quietly. He changes like a flipped table. Yet he's not ready. Because the moment he steps fully into the Christian world, he will face a rival who isn't outside the church, but inside it. A man, or a group of men, who will resent him, compete with him, and try to fracture the community he will eventually lead. And over it all, the empire watches, measuring, waiting, deciding when to squeeze. Cyprian, in these early days, still has choices. He can admire Christians from a safe distance, like one admires a storm from inside a house. He can dabble. He can argue. He can keep his status and keep his hands clean. Or he can step into the fire. And once he steps in, there will be no clean exit. Because the thing about faith in an age of persecution is that it doesn't just change what you believe, it changes what you're willing to lose. And Cyprian, the polished rhetorician of Carthage, was about to discover that the cost of truth is not paid in ideas. It's paid in flesh, in friends, in reputation, in exile, in everything that once made life feel safe. He didn't know it yet, but he was already walking toward that courtroom where ink blotted like a crushed insect and someone tried not to vomit. He was walking toward a question with only one honest answer. The first public sign that Cyprian had crossed the line wasn't a sermon or a miracle. It was silence. The kind of silence that falls at a banquet when a man who used to laugh loud suddenly stops laughing at the same jokes, when he stops leaning in for gossip, when he begins to look past the glitter and see the machinery under it, hands greased with bribery, smiles sharpened by cruelty, friendships traded like coins. Carthage had known him as a polished voice, a rising figure, a man who could shape a room with language. And then, almost like an illness you don't notice until it's already inside you, people began to sense that Cyprian was slipping away from the world that had made him, not running because he wasn't a coward, detaching. There's a particular horror in watching a successful person renounce success. It unsettles everyone who's still chasing it, because it asks a question nobody wants asked out loud. If he doesn't want this, what does that say about what I'm sacrificing my soul for? Cyprian's decision, once it ripened, didn't stay private. Christianity isn't a philosophy you can keep in your pocket. In 3rd century Carthage, it was an identity that came with consequences. Joining the church meant you were stepping into a community the empire tolerated only until it didn't. It meant new loyalties, new enemies, and a new moral spine that would not bend for convenience. So when Cyprian moved from curious to committed, it was not a gentle drift. It was a severing. He sought baptism. Imagine what that would have felt like for him. Not the modern, comfortable version with soft music and cameras, but an ancient act of submission. A wealthy adult, educated, celebrated, standing to confess that he needed to be remade, that the life that had impressed the city wasn't enough to save him from himself. And baptism in that era wasn't only symbolic. It marked you. It put you on lists. It gave officials a name that could be dragged into court later. It put you in the same family as the poor, the enslaved, the widowed, the people who could not protect themselves with influence. Cyprian, the man trained to dominate with words, was being trained to kneel. And then came the part that shocked people who thought religion was just another accessory for elite life. He began to let go of his wealth, not in a performative, look at my generosity way. In a way that made the people around him whisper, like they were watching a man bleed on purpose. Property, resources, the scaffolding of comfort. He treated it like something dangerous, like it could infect him, like it could make him hesitate later when hesitation would cost others their lives. Here is the twist nobody expects in stories like this. Cyprian didn't become weak when he surrendered. He became harder, not hard in cruelty, hard in clarity. Because once you no longer need the world's approval, the world loses one of its favorite levers. And that terrified the wrong people. Inside the Christian community of Carthage, Cyprian was not greeted as a harmless newcomer. He was greeted as a force. Even as a recent convert, he carried the kind of mental discipline the church desperately needed. Order, argument, structure, authority. The very skills that had once served ambition could now serve survival. And that's where the conflict begins to sharpen. Because whenever a community is under pressure, leadership becomes a battlefield. Some Christians in Carthage were brave. Some were terrified. Some were trying to keep their faith without losing their skin. Some wanted strictness. Others wanted mercy. Old wounds existed even before the empire's next squeeze. Rivalries, jealousies, factions. And then Cyprian arrives. Talented, respected, persuasive, and newly baptized. To some, he looked like an answer to prayer. To others, he looked like a threat in clean robes. There's an ancient ugliness in religious power struggles. People can cloak ambition in holy language and still mean the same old thing. And in Carthage, there were churchmen who had waited years for influence, who did not like the idea that this newcomer, this former, rhetorician of the elite, might rise faster than they had. One of the most dangerous kinds of enemies is the one who shares your religion but not your heart. Cyprian threw himself into study and discipline as if he were making up for lost time. He learned the scriptures not as an ornament, but as a battlefield map. He began to write, because that's what he did best, turn thought into blade-sharp language. But now the blade wasn't aimed at opponents in debate. It was aimed at the rot he had once tolerated in himself, and the fear he could see corroding others. In the Christian world, he didn't try to become interesting. He tried to become true. That kind of intensity tends to accelerate a life. Soon he was made a presbyter, an elder, a priest, and then, in a move that would light the fuse for years of conflict, the community chose him as Bishop of Carthage. Think about that moment. Picture it as a kind of spiritual election held in a city that could turn hostile overnight. A community choosing the man who would represent them, negotiate for them, discipline them, protect them, the one whose name the authorities could pin to the entire church in the region. And they chose Cyprian, a former star of Roman society, a man with friends in places that mattered, a man who understood how power worked, a man with a voice strong enough to unify a frightened people. But the very reasons he looked like the perfect bishop were exactly why the rival faction hated him. Because his election didn't only elevate him, it displaced others. And this is where you can almost feel the temperature rise. The church had always faced pressure from outside. Now it would face pressure from within, too. The rival group, men who had their own networks, their own followers, began to contest his authority. They whispered the obvious accusation. He's too new, too ambitious, too polished. Too much of his old world still clings to him. It's an easy accusation to make because it contains a grain of truth. Cyprian was new. He was gifted. He was a former insider of a corrupt system. But here is what the rival faction didn't understand. The man who had surrendered his wealth and status wasn't seeking power the way they were. He was preparing for war. Cyprian's first months as bishop weren't spent in comfort. They were spent trying to hold together a community that lived like a small island surrounded by sharks. Christian households weren't merely families. They were networks of aid. Widows, orphans, the sick, the poor, people the empire treated as expendable were the church's responsibility. That meant resources, organization, discipline. Cyprian began to shape Carthage's Christian community like someone reinforcing a building before a storm. Because storms were not hypothetical, the empire's mood toward Christians could change quickly. When emperors felt insecure, when plagues spread, when war threatened borders, Christians often became convenient scapegoats, blamed for angering the gods, blamed for social unrest, blamed for being the one group that wouldn't just participate. And that refusal, so small on the surface, was, to Rome, a dangerous message. That ultimate loyalty belongs to someone higher than Caesar. Cyprian understood the political psychology of that better than most bishops ever could. He had lived in the world of reputation and performance. He knew what authority fears, anything it cannot compel. And he also knew the ugly truth about fear inside the church. Not everyone who believes is prepared to suffer. It's easy to admire courage until courage demands payment. So he pushed his people toward unity, toward discipline, toward a shared spine. He spoke of the church as one body, because disunity in persecution is death. A fractured community is easy to crush. A divided church becomes a collection of isolated targets. And this is where the rival faction's sabotage becomes more than petty politics. If they could weaken Cyprian's authority, they could weaken the entire Christian community's ability to survive what was coming. They didn't have to call it sabotage. They could call it concern or proper order or tradition. They could call it protecting the church from a man too new to lead, but the effect was the same. Instability. Cyprian, for his part, did not respond like a politician. He responded like a surgeon, calm, deliberate, sometimes shocking in his firmness, because when a patient is bleeding, you don't negotiate with the knife. He wrote, taught, organized, and he began to show something that made both enemies and allies pause. He wasn't just intelligent. He was fearless in a very specific way, fearless of losing the things most men guard like treasure, comfort, applause, safety. That kind of fearlessness spreads. It's contagious, but it also provokes the immune system of society, the forces that exist to keep people compliant. And the more visible Cyprian became, the more a dark possibility began to hover over Carthage's Christians. Soon, the empire might decide it had tolerated enough. You could feel it in the way rumors traveled, in the way magistrates tightened their tone, in the way neighbors watched Christian homes a little longer than they used to, in the way people spoke the word sacrifice, not as a religious act, but as a test of loyalty. The rival faction inside the church wasn't waiting for that storm to pass. They were positioning themselves within it. This is the second twist, and it's cruel. In moments of looming persecution, some people don't become braver. They become strategic. They look for the safest place to stand when the lightning hits, sometimes even if that means standing on someone else's back. Cyprian began to see that his main competitor wasn't only the empire, it was the seductive voice inside the church that said, "Survive first. Compromise a little. Make the faith more convenient. Keep the community together by lowering the cost." That voice can sound merciful, but sometimes it's just fear wearing a holy mask. And Cyprian, who knew the tricks of rhetoric, recognized the mask. He had lived his whole life watching words used to excuse selfishness. Now he watched it happen in the very community he was trying to protect. So his leadership sharpened further. He spoke of loyalty, of unity, of the danger of breaking the bond of the church. He taught that faith wasn't a hobby, and the church wasn't a marketplace of opinions. He insisted that what bound Christians together was not social convenience, but spiritual reality. This was not merely theological. It was survival logic. If persecution arrived and Christians scattered into private individual faith, they would be picked off. If they stood as one, they could endure. Cyprian's rival faction, however, continued to whisper. They recruited sympathizers. They questioned his legitimacy. They tested how far they could push without being openly condemned. And the city around them grew more volatile. It's hard to describe what it's like to live under the shadow of an unpredictable state that believes it has a divine right to demand your compliance. It's like living with a blade suspended above your dinner table by a single thread. Every ordinary day, buying bread, greeting neighbors, tending children, happens beneath that thread. In Carthage, Christians lived that way. And now, because Cyprian was bishop, the blade wasn't just above the community. It was above him. He had been elected into a role that made him a beacon. And beacons attract storms. There is a moment in stories like this where the protagonist realizes, my old life is not just gone. It can never come back. Cyprian likely felt that as the social doors quietly closed. The invites faded. The comfortable alliances thinned out. People who used to greet him warmly now measured him with distance, as if faith were contagious in the wrong way. But something else opened in its place, a deeper loyalty, forged not by shared status but by shared risk. The Christian poor, who might once have avoided his gaze, now looked at him as their shepherd. Widows and orphans knew his name. The sick knew the church might feed them when the city wouldn't. Cyprian became, in a very real sense, responsible for lives. And that is what makes the coming storm unbearable to imagine. Because when persecution hits, it doesn't test abstract ideas. It tests people, families, weak bodies, children, old men who can't run, women who can't hide, new converts whose courage hasn't been trained. Cyprian knew that, which is why he began to prepare them not for comfort, but for endurance. And then, like the distant drumbeat of an army you can't yet see, the empire's next move began to stir, an approach that would demand a clear answer from every Christian in Carthage. Will you obey the gods of Rome, or will you become an enemy of the state? The question sounds dramatic, but in practice it could come down to a few grains of incense, a signature, a public gesture, a small action with a massive meaning. And the most terrifying part is this. Many people would fold, not because they didn't believe, but because fear can make the hands betray the heart. Cyprian's rival faction knew that too, which meant they were already planning what to do with the ones who would break, and how to use that breaking to seize control. Cyprian could feel the walls closing in from both sides, the empire outside, the competitors within. And standing between them was a community of ordinary people who would soon be asked to prove their faith with their bodies. He had come to God, yes, but he had also come to a crossroads where belief becomes blood serious. The life of the rhetorician had taught him to win with words. The life of the bishop was about to teach him what words are worth when men are hunting you. Before the storm broke, the church in Carthage already lived like a hunted thing. Not because Christians were always being dragged into the streets, sometimes the empire didn't bother, but because the threat was always near enough to smell, like metal in the air before lightning, a neighbor's lingering stare, a magistrate's casual question, a market vendor suddenly refusing to touch your hand when you paid, as if faith could spread like a rash. And yet, this is what shocks people who imagine ancient Christianity as quiet and gentle. The church didn't survive by being soft. It survived by being organized, stubborn, and intimate in a way that frightened outsiders. If you could have followed a Christian in Carthage on a normal week under Cyprian's leadership, you wouldn't see grand cathedrals or polished choirs. You'd see small knots of people moving carefully, often before dawn, toward a house that looked ordinary from the street. A door, a courtyard, a room lit by oil lamps that threw moving shadows over faces, faces that had learned to keep fear from turning into panic. There would be no loud announcement, no sign. The sound of worship was kept low on purpose, but the intensity was unmistakable. Scripture would be read out loud because many couldn't read it themselves. Prayers would rise like breath in cold air. People would respond in murmurs, not because they lacked passion, but because they understood the value of not attracting the wrong ears. And then came the moment that made them, in the eyes of Rome, impossible to domesticate. The Eucharist. Bread that looked like bread, wine that looked like wine. But to Christians, it was a covenant deeper than citizenship. It wasn't just a ritual. It was a declaration. We belong to Christ more than we belong to the empire. You can understand, then, why Roman officials didn't merely see this as religion. They saw a rival loyalty. Cyprian understood that too, and he shaped the church's worship like a training ground for souls. He didn't preach like a poet trying to be adored. He preached like a man trying to keep people alive. His voice, once designed to win applause, became a tool for steel. He called people to chastity and honesty, yes, but also to courage, to charity that wasn't a hobby, to unity that wasn't optional. He didn't want Christians to be admirable. He wanted them to be unbreakable, and he didn't lead from a distance. The poor were not scenery to him. Widows and orphans were not moral props. Under Cyprian's direction, the church became a kind of underground lifeline. Food, alms, care for the sick, burial for the dead. Things a city would often neglect once panic or plague hit. This mattered more than theology debates ever could, because in crisis people don't ask what you believe. They ask whether you show up. But while Cyprian was building this disciplined, dangerous kind of community, the enemy inside the walls kept sharpening his knives. The rival faction that had hated his election didn't fade away. It adapted. They learned how to talk like loyal Christians while undermining him. They learned how to sound concerned while spreading suspicion. They measured every decision he made, waiting for a mistake big enough to turn into a weapon. And the empire gave them their chance. In the year the order came down, an imperial demand that people perform sacrifice to the Roman gods and prove it, fear didn't creep in. It detonated. Imagine it as bureaucracy with teeth. Not a chaotic mob, not a random riot. A system. A demand to appear before officials, make an offering, and receive a certificate proving you had complied. In practice, it turned religion into paperwork, into a queue, into a signature that could save your life or damn your conscience. For Christians, it wasn't simply, do you believe? It was, will you publicly deny your Lord to stay alive? Some Christians refused and were arrested. Some were tortured. Some were executed. But many, many more than anyone wanted to admit, broke. Some offered the sacrifice. Some burned incense with shaking hands and told themselves God would understand. Some bribed officials for certificates without actually sacrificing, a kind of cowardice disguised as cleverness. Some ran. Some hid. Some disappeared into the city and pretended they had never been Christians at all. The church didn't just face persecution. It faced a hemorrhage. This is where Cyprian's leadership becomes controversial in a way that still makes people argue. When the persecution hit hard, Cyprian did not immediately present himself to be arrested. He went into hiding, and the rivals pounced. "Coward," they whispered. "He tells us to be brave, but he saves himself." It sounds convincing, especially if you want it to sound convincing. But here's the twist. Cyprian's absence wasn't silence. It was strategy. From hiding, he wrote, constantly, letters that moved through the city like contraband. Instructions, encouragement, discipline, comfort. He coordinated aid for imprisoned Christians and their families. He guided clergy. He addressed moral collapse. He tried to keep the church from splitting into terrified fragments. He wasn't hiding because he feared death. He was hiding because the bishop was a nerve center, and if the nerve center was severed too early, the body could go limp. But strategy rarely looks noble while people are bleeding. So the rival faction used his hiding to build a narrative. They began to present themselves as the real brave leaders. They courted the admiration of confessors, Christians who had endured imprisonment or torture and survived. They flattered these confessors like celebrities, like living proof that their faction had the moral high ground. And then they did something that sounds merciful on the surface but was, in Cyprian's eyes, lethal. They started handing out forgiveness cheaply. The crisis created a new, vicious question. What about those who had lapsed, those who had sacrificed, bribed, denied, or fled? Could they be readmitted to the church? How? When? Under what conditions? Some people, broken by fear, crawled back begging, not politely, not with good manners, with the raw desperation of people who had watched their own souls betray them. And some confessors, full of adrenaline, full of spiritual pride, full of the intoxicating idea that their suffering made them authorities, began to issue letters of peace. They would declare a lapsed person forgiven, as if endurance under torture had given them power to overwrite discipline. Cyprian saw the danger immediately. Not because he didn't want mercy. He absolutely wanted mercy. But because mercy without truth becomes poison. If you make forgiveness a souvenir handed out by charismatic heroes, you turn the church into a popularity contest. You teach people that fear has no consequences, that betrayal can be erased like chalk with a dramatic gesture. You cheapen repentance. You train the community to break again the next time the empire tightens its fist. And there was something even uglier. Cyprian realized his rivals weren't only being soft-hearted. They were building a power base. If they could become the faction that welcomed everyone back, they could win crowds. If they could paint Cyprian as harsh, absent, elitist, they could seize the church by moral theater. So Cyprian answered with a weapon he had mastered long ago: language. His letters cut through the confusion like cold water. He insisted that the church had to remain one body under legitimate shepherds, not fractured into factions led by whoever felt spiritually dramatic that week. He insisted that reconciliation was real, but it required repentance and order. He warned against arrogance disguised as courage, against ego disguised as holiness. It wasn't abstract. People's lives were at stake, because the lapsed weren't just individuals. They were families. They were parents. They were children. They were business owners whose public sacrifice had protected the neighborhood from suspicion. Their decisions affected whether other Christians would be exposed, whether meeting places would be discovered, whether arrests would cascade. The rival faction, however, didn't back down. They escalated. They began holding their own gatherings, their own reconciliations, their own unofficial authority, an alternative church within the church. They encouraged resentment against Cyprian's discipline. They used the suffering of confessors as a badge. We are the brave ones. We are the merciful ones. We are the true heart of the church. And now Cyprian faced a nightmare. Persecution outside, schism inside. Then came the next twist, because the conflict in Carthage echoed a larger conflict across the Christian world. In Rome, a hardline movement rose, insisting that those who lapsed could never be forgiven, never restored. Not after such betrayal, not after such shame. Their logic sounded pure. The church must be spotless, uncompromising, uncontaminated. But purity can be a kind of cruelty when it forgets the human body. Cyprian found himself trapped between two extremes. One side wanted forgiveness with no discipline, easy mercy that could become moral collapse. The other side wanted discipline with no mercy, hard purity that could become spiritual execution. And both sides, both extremes, threatened the unity of the church. This was Cyprian's battlefield. Not swords and spears, souls and authority, mercy and justice, fear and pride. He returned from hiding when the worst pressure eased enough to travel, and his presence did not soothe the conflict. It intensified it, because a leader who returns is forced to answer a question that people have been chewing on in his absence. What kind of shepherd are you? Cyprian answered with counsels. gatherings of bishops and clergy to decide discipline together, not because he was indecisive, but because unity required shared judgment. He pushed for a path that was as stern as it needed to be and as merciful as it could be. Real penance, real restoration, real authority, real healing. Not a show, not a shortcut. The rival faction saw this as an obstacle to their takeover, so they attacked harder. They accused him of pride, of tyranny, of being too Roman in his thinking, of loving rules more than people. They tried to peel away clergy. They tried to create a parallel leadership structure. They tried to force a reality where Cyprian was merely one voice among many, instead of the bishop holding the community together. Cyprian's response was not a tantrum. It was something colder and more frightening. He refused to negotiate the existence of the church. He wrote with a kind of controlled intensity that made it clear division is not merely messy, it is deadly. He treated schism not as a difference of opinion, but as an infection. Not because he enjoyed power, but because he had seen what fear does to communities. It fractures them into isolated cells, and then the empire crushes them one by one. The persecution had exposed cowardice. The schism exposed ambition. And then, because life loves to pile horrors together, Carthage was hit by sickness. A plague moved through the city like a hungry fog. Bodies that had walked yesterday were suddenly limp today. Fever, vomit, weakness, the smell of waste in narrow streets, the sound of mourning that never really stopped. People who could afford it fled to villas outside the city. People who couldn't afford it stayed and died. And once again, the world asked Christians, "What are you really? If your love is only for your own group, this is where it fails. If your faith is only a badge, this is where it peels off." Under Cyprian, the church responded with a kind of courage that looked insane to outsiders. Christians cared for the sick. Not only Christians sick, everyone. They organized aid. They buried the dead when families were too frightened to touch their own. They fed people who were not their friends. It's one thing to refuse incense. It's another thing to carry a feverish stranger covered in filth when everyone else steps back. That's where the disgust returns. The visceral bodily ugliness of love in a dying city. Not romantic love. Not poetry love. The kind of love that touches disease. And it made an impression. Because nothing exposes a society's true gods like a plague. When comfort collapses, people discover what they really worship. Cyprian preached into that horror, not with sentimental words, but with a fierce insistence that suffering did not mean abandonment. He taught Christians not to fear death the way the city feared it, not because death is pleasant, but because Christ had stepped into it first. At the same time, the rivalry didn't pause just because bodies were dropping. If anything, it grew nastier. The rival faction could point at the chaos and say, "See, Cyprian's discipline divides us. We need easier solutions. We need leaders who don't make everything hard." Cyprian could point at the same chaos and say, "See, this is exactly why we need unity and moral seriousness. Because when the world burns, shortcuts don't save anyone." So the church in Carthage lived on two fronts. The front of compassion in a plague-ridden city, the front of internal conflict, over authority, repentance, and unity. And over it all was the empire, watching, deciding whether Christians were merely inconvenient or a problem that needed to be carved out. By now, Cyprian was no longer just a bishop trying to shepherd. He had become a symbol. To Christians, he represented disciplined mercy, repentance that restores, authority that protects. To rivals, he represented a barrier, a man who would not be manipulated. To Rome, he represented a nerve center, an organizer whose influence could not be casually ignored. And the frightening thing about becoming a symbol is that symbols are easier to target than ideas. A storm is coming again. This time sharper, more personal, more final. Because the empire can tolerate many things. But it rarely tolerates a community that learns how to suffer, how to stay united, and how to outlove fear. And Cyprian, once the city's polished rhetorician, had helped create exactly that kind of community. which means the next question won't be asked in whispers or paperwork. It will be asked with soldiers. It will be asked with exile. It will be asked with the blade. The second storm didn't arrive with shouting mobs. It arrived the way empires prefer to kill, with an order, a sealed instruction, a list of names, a quiet tightening of the net. And this time the empire wasn't merely annoyed. It was deliberate. When Rome decided Christians had become too resilient, too organized, too publicly visible, it stopped treating the church like a nuisance and started treating it like a threat. In Carthage, that meant one thing. The bishop would be targeted. Because you can terrorize a flock for years and still not control it. But if you can break the shepherd in public, you can make courage look foolish. You can make unity look pointless. You can teach the lesson Rome loved teaching. Your God may be invisible, but our sword is not. Cyprian knew what was coming before it arrived. Not because he had prophecies, but because he understood politics. He understood how power behaves when it feels itself slipping. When people stop being afraid, authority becomes embarrassed, and embarrassed authority turns vicious. So when the summons finally came, it didn't surprise him. What surprised others was the way he moved toward it. No panic, no bargaining, no dramatic speeches in the street. Just the steady walk of a man who had already decided long ago what his life was for. He was brought before officials and pressed again with that old, deceptively small demand. Honor the Roman gods, offer sacrifice, perform the gesture, make peace with the system. To Rome, it was compliance. To Cyprian, it was betrayal. And here's a detail that makes the scene feel colder. The state doesn't need rage to destroy you. It only needs paperwork and routine. A magistrate with a controlled voice. A clerk ready with ink. Soldiers whose faces say, "This is just a job." Cyprian answered with the same stubborn clarity that had made him both loved and hated. He would not sacrifice. So they did what empires often do before they execute. They isolated. Exile. They sent him away from his city like you remove the keystone from an arch. Quietly, hoping the whole structure collapses on its own afterward. Cyprian was taken to a coastal place, far from the center of his influence. The Mediterranean wind would have been salt and sharp. The sun, too clean. The kind of landscape that looks peaceful until you realize peace can be a disguise for punishment. And this is where one of the strangest twists of his story happens. Exile didn't silence him. It refined him. From exile, he continued to write, to instruct, to encourage, to hold the church together with words that now had the weight of impending death behind them. His rival faction, those competitors inside the church who had once tried to fracture his authority, found it harder to play their games. When the cost of leadership was no longer prestige, but danger. Some rivals grow brave when their opponent is removed. But many rivals grow quiet when the empire's shadow becomes personal. Because it's easy to fight for influence when it's safe. It's harder when the prize is a target painted on your chest. And Cyprian, paradoxically, became even more dangerous to his enemies. Because distance made him larger. A bishop in exile stops looking like a politician and starts looking like a witness. The church begins to treat his letters like lifelines. His words travel faster than his body ever could. Rome wanted him cut off. Instead, he became a voice that wouldn't stop echoing. Then the empire escalated. What had been pressure became a blade. New demands came down. Bishops and clergy were not just to be punished, they were to be neutralized. The state had tried intimidation and bureaucracy. Now it aimed for decapitation, literally and figuratively. Cyprian was ordered back. And this return is one of those cinematic moments history gives you without asking permission. The shepherd returning to the city. Not to reclaim comfort, but to step into the place where death is waiting with your name on it. You can imagine the streets of Carthage when he came back. People watching from doorways, faces tight, whispers sharp. Some Christians would have felt relief, others terror, because his presence was both protection and provocation, a blessing and a magnet for danger. And the rivals? The competitors? This was their final test. If they truly believed Cyprian had been illegitimate, if they truly believed they were the truer leaders, here was their chance. Stand taller than him. Lead better than him. Suffer more bravely than him. But history has a cruel way of revealing what people actually love. Many who had once challenged his authority discovered that martyrdom is a very different stage than church politics. It doesn't reward cleverness. It doesn't care about your faction. It doesn't ask whether you won the argument. It asks only one question. What will you do when survival demands betrayal? Cyprian did not hide this time. Not because hiding had been cowardice before, but because the moment had changed. The church had been held together. The witness now needed a face. So when the arrest came, when soldiers arrived, when the state moved to seize him, the city didn't see a man scrambling. It saw a man standing. And there is something chillingly human about the final days before execution. They're full of ordinary details that make death feel obscene. Meals, sandals, breath, the way cloth scratches your neck, the way a friend's hands shake when they try to be helpful. Cyprian, knowing the end was close, reportedly arranged practical things. He wasn't floating above reality. He was inside it. He understood that courage isn't a mood. It's a series of choices made in the presence of fear. The night before, the city would have felt different. That tense quiet, that awareness that tomorrow will change stories into legends. And then morning. A crowd gathers because Rome loves a public lesson. The air is bright. Too bright. The kind of sun that makes everything look sharp-edged. Dust underfoot. Soldiers in formation. Officials in clean garments. A place prepared not for justice, but for demonstration. Cyprian is brought out. This is where the visuals cut hard. An older man now, once a rising star of the city, now wearing the face of someone who has already died inwardly to the things that used to own him. He is given the final chance. Sacrifice. Comply. Live. And again, he refuses. Not with a theatrical scream. Not with a poetic flourish, with that same infuriating calm. So, the sentence is read. Death. Beheading. You can almost hear how the crowd responds, some with pity, some with excitement, some with disgust, some with fear that feels like anger. In a crowd like that, there are always mixed motives. People don't come to executions only because they hate the condemned. Sometimes they come because they're relieved it isn't them. Sometimes they come because they want the state to feel strong again. Sometimes they come because they're curious in the same ugly way people stare at accidents. And then comes the moment that turns a man into a saint. Cyprian removes his outer garment. It's a small action, but it's loaded. It says, I will not be dragged into death. I will walk into it. He kneels. He prays. And then, perhaps the most disturbing detail of all, because it's so bodily, so ordinary, he gives money to the executioner. Imagine that. Paying the man who is about to swing the blade, not as a bribe, not to escape, but as an eerie, controlled acknowledgement that the executioner is a human being too, one trapped in Rome's machine. That gesture is both satisfying and sickening at once. Satisfying because it shows Cyprian's composure, sickening because it reminds you how transactional death can become under empire. He is blindfolded, a cloth across the eyes, a final darkness before the final darkness. The sword rises. There's a sound, metal moving through air, not poetic, not symbolic, just physics. And then the body does what bodies do. It falls, it spills, it becomes a reality that no ideology can sanitize. Rome wanted a lesson. Look how fragile your leaders are. But the church saw a different lesson. Look how free a human being can become. That's the third twist. Martyrdom, intended to humiliate, often becomes the very thing that inspires. Because the empire can kill bodies, but it cannot easily kill meaning. And Christians were building a culture where meaning mattered more than fear. So Cyprian dies, an African bishop in an African city under Roman authority. And the story does not end where the blood hits the ground. It begins traveling. His writings survived because they weren't just pious poetry, they were crisis documents. how to hold a community together under terror, how to balance mercy with moral seriousness, how to resist the seduction of division when division feels easier than courage. His insistence on unity, the idea that Christians are not simply individuals with private beliefs but a body bound together, became one of the most influential strands in how many churches understood themselves. And here's the thing. Unity is not a cute concept in places where survival is difficult. Unity becomes oxygen, which brings us finally across centuries and across geography to the question you asked that most people never even think to ask. Why is Saint Cyprian honored in Nigeria? Because Nigeria understands in its bones what Cyprian lived through. Nigeria is one of the world's major centers of Christianity. Vibrant, diverse, deeply rooted, and often tested by pressure, conflict, and the constant need for communities to hold together without losing their soul. In such a context, saints are not museum pieces. They are mirrors. Cyprian is honored there for several reasons that land with real force. First, he is African. Not African as a modern political slogan, but African in the historical geographical sense. A bishop from North Africa leading a major Christian community long before Christianity became associated with European power. For many Nigerian Christians, early African saints like Cyprian are a powerful reminder that Christianity is not a foreign import, stapled onto Africa. It has deep African roots, intellectual and spiritual, reaching back to the earliest centuries. That matters a lot, especially in any context where people have tried to tell Africans that faith must come with someone else's cultural ownership. Cyprian's existence says no. The faith had African giants from the start. Second, he is a martyr, but not a reckless one. His story isn't simply he died bravely. It's he led wisely under terror. He navigated fear, collapse, betrayal, internal competition, external persecution, and still kept his people from disintegrating. That kind of leadership is respected anywhere Christians have faced real-world pressure. Not theoretical pressure, but pressure that touches families, livelihoods, and safety. Third, he fought a rival inside the community without turning the church into a civil war. This is huge. Cyprian's key conflict wasn't only with Rome. It was with rivals who wanted to hijack the crisis, either by making repentance too cheap or by making mercy impossible. Nigeria, like any large and diverse Christian landscape, knows what internal fragmentation can do. Cyprian becomes a cautionary tale and a guiding figure. Disagreement cannot be allowed to become destruction. Discipline cannot be allowed to become cruelty. Mercy cannot be allowed to become collapse. Fourth, his name travels well because his courage is practical. That's why you find Cyprian remembered in sermons, in liturgical calendars used by many Christian traditions, in the naming of children, clergy, and institutions. Cyprian becomes a name that carries a story. The African bishop who didn't flinch when the empire demanded his soul. Naming is a form of honor. And in many Nigerian communities, names are not decoration. They are meaning. And finally, this is the emotional reason, the one that doesn't fit neatly into theology. Cyprian's life offers a kind of satisfaction people secretly crave, because his story resolves a tension we all carry. We want to believe that a human life can be more than performance, more than fear, more than self-protection. Cyprian starts as a man built for status, for applause, for comfort, and he ends as a man who can face the blade without surrendering his core. That transformation is the real miracle, and it's why the empire failed. Rome wanted him to become a warning. Instead, he became a compass. A man from Africa whose words outlived Roman edicts, whose blood outlasted Roman steel, whose insistence on unity and courage still feels alive in places where faith is not a hobby, but a lifeline. So when someone in Nigeria honors Saint Cyprian, they are not only honoring a distant martyr, they are honoring a message that still punches through centuries. You can be remade. You can be brave. You can love your people more than you love your safety. And you can refuse to let fear or rivals decide who you are.